Hi, and so Blizzard have posted their philosophy for Battle for Azeroth, in particular the way it relates to class design on the forums. I'll of course post a link down below as well as show sections of it here as well. I'm talking about it. They did this before Legion as well. They did it pretty much coinciding with the opening of what was then called Legion Alpha. So we assume that this is also designed to coincide with the opening of Battle for Azeroth Alpha, Beta, whatever they want to call it. Maybe that's in the next couple of days. Maybe it's next week. But I would think that by this time next week, then the first wave will be in. That usually consisting of the major influencers and senior theory crafters all getting disconnected repeatedly. As will happen, of course, when it first opens up. Now, they've said a number of things. I'm just going to set out my stall here before I go through and offer up my own thoughts. As anyone who's followed me for any sort of time will know, first and foremost, my philosophy when it comes to class design is balance. It must be the case that you do not gimp someone from doing a particular piece of content just because of the class they have chosen. Now, if it's simply the case that they can't do a piece of content because they need to get good themselves as players, fine, that's okay. But if it's the case that you need a lot of classes to do a particular content that find it very, very easy to do and much less skilled players can do it, and the ones who maybe are more capable as players but chose the wrong class can't, that's no bueno for me. I mean, that is the ultimate tenet of any sport, any competitive activity. It must, amongst all things, be fair. Now, Blizzard don't agree. So I'm going to go through it. I'm going to explain where I support their statements, where I'm critical of them. Be aware I'm going to be critical of some of these statements, but I can at least set out what my thinking is about it. And then, of course, you're free, as Blizzard do, to disagree with me in the comments below. So here we go. First one. It says, one area we're trying to focus on across all classes is to better emphasize what makes each class unique and provide greater distinction amongst their various capabilities, especially when it comes to utility. Now, immediately I have a thought here, and that is that in Legion, they spent a lot of time and resources massively redefining this class fantasy, as they called it. Now, I have a couple of issues, one with this statement and one with their concept of class fantasy. First of all, it didn't seem to be class fantasy. It seemed to be spec fantasy. They kept wanting to try and have very unique but powerful abilities assigned to individual specs. Had it just been class fantasy, I don't think it would have been as big a problem to deal with because there are 12 classes. But because it was spec fantasy, that's 36 classes. That's too much. That is too much to provide unique things for all of them in a balanced way. Now, if they're actually going to refocus on the class and not so much the spec, obviously specs need to play differently. I mean, that's a given with many classes such as mine, the Paladin anyway, because some of those specs will be different roles anyway, easy. But if the utility features are per spec rather than per class, again, they're going to fall into the same pitfalls. Then the other thing is this idea about we're trying to focus to better emphasize. They spent a very long time redefining this class fantasy, and they weren't afraid to make changes throughout the Legion expansion either. They were very open about that. So what I would say is at this point, if you still need to do a lot of work redefining that, I think you failed. Your original philosophy has been demonstrably failure. It has been, because how can after all this time you still have a lot of work to do on it? I don't understand how someone can have this much time and go through this many drafts and ideas and supposedly taking feedback and changing things, removing things that clearly didn't work, even though we told them 9 months before they got rid of it wouldn't work, and so on and so on and so on, and still think that their original philosophy is fine. Anyway. It says tools that fall, so it's explaining what utility are. Tools that fall outside of core role functions like damage, healing or mitigation. Great, we all agree on what utility is. Part of what makes you feel excitement and pride in your class is pulling off a heroic moment and feeling the appreciation of your group when individually contributing to a shared success. Fantastic. That feeling is eroded when so many classes bring similar abilities. No. And you feel you're rarely providing something distinctive. Again, I strongly disagree. In any form of group content, whether it be PvP, whether it's arenas or battlegrounds, whether it's Mythic plus dungeons, whether it's raids, like, for example, as melee, we all have interrupts on roughly the same cooldown. Do I feel every time I'm part of an interrupt rotation that, oh, I'm not doing it distinctively? Oh, no. No, I'm part of the team. My interrupts are part of that fight. I'm part of it. And that's absolutely fine. What's less fine is when you're on a boss that needs a ridiculous amount of, say, crowd control, or lots of soaking that needs special defensives on a shortish cooldown. And some people of certain classes don't have access to that at all and are therefore almost excluded from that group. You know, that's my feeling there. And I don't think they've got any right to say that that feeling is eroded there without actually having that feedback. And I know they haven't got that feedback because, again, this is one of those classic situations where they could easily verify whether or not we feel like that by asking us. But we don't get in-game surveys that ask us, you know, do you agree with this statement that, you know, having abilities that other classes have makes your distinctiveness feel eroded? Blah, blah, blah. Do you agree or disagree? They could easily ask that. They're not interested. What they mean is that some very noisy or influential people who may actually be a minority of the development team, you know, don't think that it's a majority decision all the time. It may be a very vocal and influential minority that are chipping away at this. They feel like that. Not necessarily everyone. Anyway, and you feel you're rarely provided... We've done that. Sorry. More differentiation in this area will create situations where another class can do something that you can't. In other words, you're benched then, by the way. Sorry. But you will similarly bring tools to the table that your allies lack. So that's their turn to be benched. Isn't that fantastic? Isn't that nice? That contrast causes members of a team to be more dependent on each other to succeed. No, it doesn't. Again, coming back to the interrupt idea. If you need an interrupt rotation, you know, only having interrupts on a few classes just means you'd have to take more of those classes. And the people who don't have them are not in on that fight. You know, the others are dependent on me to interrupt when I need to interrupt. And if we all had, for example, AoE stuns, which comes later, something they particularly want to have a go at, and you need to set up rotations of those, then you're still part of it by contributing to that. So I completely dismiss that argument at all. So anyway, that's the first paragraph. I'm not very happy so far, as you can probably guess. So the next one. Pursuing this goal will likely involve adding some new abilities or adding previously removed abilities. Again, after all this time, haven't you got it right yet? I mean, if they were at least saying, you know, they didn't want to add or remove whole abilities during Legion, that would sort of be okay. But remember what they said. They want to further redefine it as if it's still a work in progress. They haven't got, right, we've got it now, we've got it. As soon as the BFA beta comes out, you'll see exactly what it is, and that's how it's going to be. But that's not what they're saying. So, yeah, changing abilities to give classes a more unique signature where needed. And again, that focus on classes, which I'm totally fine with. If the focus is on classes, that's going to make it a lot easier. But I strongly suspect that what they actually mean, just like they meant with Legion, is spec. It will also likely involve reining in the availability of certain utility types, especially those that are so widespread that they rarely provide meaningful contrast between classes. As a notable example, area of effect stuns, some of the most powerful utility that exists, for dungeons particularly, certainly, are so abundant that most groups have at least one or two. Yes, they do. But the thing is, if you remove it from most classes, you're still going to want in your group one or two people with it. But what you'll be doing is narrowing down the number of players who can provide that utility. So they get into the groups very easily. Other people outside looking in through the window go, can I join? It just doesn't make sense. As a result, decision making around that tool is often less about when it would be best used and more about avoiding overlap with AoE stuns. But it's still going to happen because people are still going to take the people who... If there's a particular piece of utility that trivializes a very dangerous mechanic, you are going to always try your best to take the people who can bring it. And the people who can attract those players will just do better than those who can't. All you're doing is giving that task, that dungeon or raid or arena or whatever, a much tougher time of it because they can't get the ideal balance of group. So not only does this sometimes drown out the importance of other crowd control in dungeons, but it means that a class bringing an AoE stun to a group is not the major strategy defining asset that it should be. So, you know, again, the way that I could use the same argument for that, it's just a case, you know, you're not going to have a group suddenly go, oh, we haven't got that AoE stun anymore, so we'd better use polymorph. No, they're going to say, oh, we want someone with an AoE stun, preferably 2. Our goal is that whatever powerful kind of utility a class brings, it's something that your group will be happy to have added to their toolbox as they approach a challenge. I mean, obviously, we don't know what they're thinking of in terms of this utility. They must have had some ideas, and we're presumably going to see the kernels of those ideas when it goes open. When we get the first people who'll get in, we'll see what they're reporting on. Hopefully, someone will play a Retribution Paladin from my point of view, but you know, and we'll see what they've got in mind and judge it at that point. I think, to be fair, but the philosophy itself is just fraught with danger because, again, it assumes a sort of behaviour that isn't going to happen. And they've fallen into that trap before where they do something to try and encourage a particular behaviour, but the opposite happens, and predictably so. So here is a classic example of they're going to say, your group isn't going to have these AoE stuns anymore, so you're going to have to use other CC. Whereas the player base is going to go, no, we'll just get classes that have that AoE stun. The ones who can attract whoever they want, or play whatever they want if they play multiple characters. So on to the next little section. The goal of contrast between the abilities of different specializations is not limited to utility. Now again, they're talking about specializations. They've veered away from class to spec. And this is my issue. It's almost now at this point, they're using those words as if they mean the same thing. And that's my fear. Because it's not. There's a difference between spec and class. If you're going to have class identity, I fully support that. But again, the use in the word specialization here makes me worried. We're also looking at different specialization strengths and weaknesses in their main role. Damage dealing or DPS, healing or tanking, and making sure everyone has something to get excited about and an opportunity to shine. Some DPS specializations are bursty, doing fast damage. Some live for attrition, wearing away their target. Some specializations prefer to isolate and drill into a single target, where others revel in blowing up huge packs of monsters. Now, the issue there is it's making it sound like that's a good thing, but of course, again, for raiding and for dungeons, but especially for raiding, that's not the case, because otherwise, person who's good at single target focus, you're going to bring them along on the boss that's just pure single target. Not so much on the one where there's loads of ads. So when there's loads of ads that have to die really quickly, you're going to take the bursty AoE one. Again, you're telling a player that they're going to be benched on a fight because of the class they've chosen, not because you don't trust them to do the mechanics. Inherently wrong there. So I won't need to keep going over that. That's my viewpoint. It says much of this plays out naturally due to the varying sets of damaging abilities, but we are working more intently than in the past to ensure an appropriate variety and spread of DPS strengths and weaknesses. And again, because they're talking about specializations, like a rogue might think, oh, that's fine. You know, I'll have a spec for single target, I'll have a spec for AoE, I'll have a spec for the old bursty, whatever. Great. What about a class that has one DPS spec? Maybe they'll do it with talents. But next section. But first, let's finish this one off. Likewise, healers and tanks should have a bit more identity through their unique healing and mitigation profiles. I do have to say, I think healers have plenty of identity. I think they are very different to each other. I also think the same is true of tanks. I think healers more so, but I think it's definitely true of both. So I don't think there would actually need to be a massive amount of work, if I'm honest, with healers and tanks. Another part of this approach involves working with our content design teams to collaborate on a world where quests, dungeons and raids create opportunities for all types of class strengths to shine. Now, I would like this. I sort of support this statement. It is slightly ambiguous though. But my criticism, especially with Tomb of Sargeras, but raiding in general, has been that it's been very obvious, and this is not just this expansion, previous expansions as well, that the class design team don't really talk to the encounter design team, because otherwise you would not be holding up as an example of utility something that never comes in useful in a raid, or almost never, maybe once or twice in a whole expansion. Compared to, and they compare that, they say that's just as good as this piece of utility that someone can use on every single fight in the whole expansion, because it's not. So they'll say, oh, well, that's really good, for this situation, and then talk about a situation that just doesn't crop up. And that's the issue. So working with the encounter design team and actually recognizing that if a piece of utility, although in theory, in a situation where it would be useful, would be really useful, that situation doesn't occur in an expansion, or like a raid tier, or in Mythic Plus dungeons, particularly the more popular dungeons, because there are going to be more popular dungeons. In that case, you might as well rate that utility as fairly worthless, but they don't. They don't. That's the issue. Now, the way you could read this is by collaborating with the encounter design team. It could be a way of going, okay, well, we need everyone's utility to be useful, so that there isn't a boss that comes along where you have to bench these people of this class. Particularly when it's the very last one, because sometimes when you progress through a raid, some people just have to be benched on the odd boss. It's not nice, but you accept that. It's a very different kettle of fish on the very final boss of the tier, the very end boss. Everyone wants to be in there killing it for the first time with their guildmates. And of course, some people do have to miss out, but they should have to miss out because they're not playing well enough, because they're not doing the mechanics well enough, rather than because you pick that class, because that's really unfair. It says, if we're arming classes with distinct tools that provide powerful answers to different situations, it's important that the game's content provides a broad array of challenges that play into those different tools. Fully support that. If that's what they're going to do, I am absolutely 100% behind it. And I will copy that out, and I'm going to stick it somewhere. I'm going to make it into my wallpaper, that statement, because I'm going to hold them to that in Battle for Azeroth. Because if they do that, fantastic. That is a really good aim. When you come up with a list of aims that you want to do, your success criteria for the following expansion, that is a worthy success criterion. Absolutely. It's important that the game's content provides a broad array of challenges that play into those different tools. Yes. Yes. The issue becomes, whose responsibility is it? Because I know how teams work in a workplace. Whose responsibility is it to make sure that's the case? Is it the class design's responsibility to make sure that they're coming up with sensible tools that the encounter design team can use? Or is it the encounter design team's responsibility to make sure that there are mechanics on bosses that utilize those tools? That will be interesting. I mean, we'll never know the answer to that without being on the inside. But, that's, again, one thing that could potentially scupper it, even if they're fully seized of that. Okay, so next one. Then on to talents now. So my, again, philosophy with talents, slightly different point of view, because I'm a paladin. As a paladin, much like with priests and monks and demon hunters, we have one DPS spec, just one. So we haven't got a spec that'd be really good on this fight, but it's not so good on that fight. But I've got another spec that'd be good on that fight. It doesn't work like that. I know it's a pain for pure DPS classes having to keep multiple sets of gear and having to learn different specs and different playstyles, but nonetheless, you've got that situation. You've got a spec that's good on single target, another one that's better on AoE, another one that's better on this. When you've only got one spec, you essentially need your talents to make sure that you can switch some things around and be good on the different fights. Because, no one wants a situation as a class that plays a single DPS spec to be great at everything. I don't want my spec to be really good at single target, to be able to top the meters on single target and then do the same thing on a cleave boss. That's not right. That shouldn't happen. What I want is to be able to have one talent set that goes, okay, that's what we do for single target, but I wouldn't be very good if there were a load of ads. Okay, but then this fight, there's going to be ads all the time. They're actually really important to kill, so I'll go for this spec instead. And then another fight, it's a council fight. There's going to be 2 bosses. I'm going to cleave 2 bosses throughout most of the fight. All right, I'll choose this spec. That is how it should work. Do Blizzard agree? No. The overall talent system will remain largely unchanged, but we will be refining our approach. One of the major challenges in setting up talent rows is that they are serving 2 conflicting desires. Choices within a row should be meaningfully varied, but also should not feel like they are simply a test of which is best in a particular setting. Oh my god. If a row has 3 similar area damage talents, your decision could feel like it boils down to a complex maths problem. If a row mixes area damage and single target talents, you're likely to feel you should change talents to suit the content you're doing. Yes! Which also rarely feels like a choice. There is no choice. There is the best thing to use, and that's it. And this is the problem. When you try to come up with what they call a meaningful choice, in other words, you choose which one you like, you play what you like. The problem with that is you end up with dead talents because you create a couple of talents which, oh, in that situation, that's all right, in that situation, that's all right. And the rest of them, you never take in any situation because you know what? It's not as strong. That is why, at the moment, I have a particular talent set which I use on every single raid boss, in Mythic Plus as well. I don't really change my talents. I don't change my talents at all. I don't need to. Because the talent set that I am using at the moment is the best I can have for every realistic situation at the moment. I'm not saying there haven't been bosses in the past in the expansion where it wouldn't be changed a bit. But at the moment, for every boss I'm doing, I'm using the same ones. But there are other ones that even through the expansion have never been used. They're completely dead in the water. They are never the best one to use in any situation. And that is the problem. They're trying to have this, oh, it's a choice, what you feel like, play what you feel like. Which is fine for a casual player. A casual player, some casual players, you know, could play with no talents at all and they still have a great time. That's great. But the players who really need to get the benefit from the talents, they're always going to choose which one's best. And we understand, by the way, that what's best for one person isn't best for another. Sometimes what determines your best talents is the gear you've got, or maybe even the particular strategy. Because sometimes you might have 2 people of the same class and roughly the same gear, but in one guild, their strategy involves them doing this job, and in another guild it involves them doing a different job. And yeah, you might change your talents based on that. But that person is still always going to use that particular talent. And it's not based on the playstyle they prefer, but what's going to give them the best output, the best results. That's ultimately what it's about. They know that. That's always been the case. You know, they tried to move over to this new talent system because they complained about cookie cutter builds with the old talent system, going back a long years now. It's still cookie cutter, sorry. It's not cookie cutter for all people playing that class, granted. You know, although sometimes it is. But, you know, for a particular person, it's pretty cut and straight what you use. Anyway. The most successful talent rows are those with options that have a generally consistent role in your toolkit, but have very different delivery and mechanics, allowing players to thoughtfully customize their identity and complexity. Now, when I was discussing this on the stream earlier on, I immediately had a question for Blizzard. They're not going to answer it because they're not going to listen to it. But I immediately had a question. Okay, so you're saying the most successful talent rows are those with options that have blah, 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 blah. So there are 36 specs. Each spec has 6 talent rows. 7. Can't remember how many bloody talents I've got now. Quite a lot of talent rows. Now, that means you should be able to give an example of a talent row that's particularly successful. But they didn't do that. They didn't say, for example, you know, the level 30 talent row for Restoration Druids. I don't know whether that does meet those criteria. But here's the problem. Again, it's quite ambiguous because you're looking at it and you think, even if you disagree with the philosophy, it's very difficult to attack the specific sentence because they're not given an example of what they think is successful. And that's disappointing. That is really disappointing. And then the final paragraph says, one other lesson we've already begun implementing in Legion patches is being careful with the effects that talents have on pacing, how frequently you get to press your buttons, and how often you generate resources and cooldowns. Of course, many talents affect the pacing of a rotation. Sure, they do. And this will continue to be the case, as these are some of the talents with the most noticeable and fun feel to them. Great. But if you have access to multiple talents that slow down or speed up your rotation, players can end up outside the bounds of what feels good to play. For example, being resource starved or flooded. As we review talents going forward, we will try to avoid this by having strong resource generating talents compete with each other and better limiting the pacing change allowable from a single talent. I'm not particularly going to attack that line of thinking at all. I don't think there's anything wrong with it per se. My issue with it, it sounds to me like they're giving themselves a big job that doesn't have to be done. There's quite a lot for them to do already. This sounds like something that is a very big job, and if it doesn't go right, they might actually end up doing the opposite of what they intend. But the amount of time they're going to have to spend on getting this right. And also the thing is, once you've done this, like, and the expansion comes out and they want to monkey about with something, because let's say a talent doesn't quite work out as they'd intended, much as has the case in Legion, for example, take Surrender to Madness, and they want to monkey about with it, they could basically, it's like Jenga, they take one thing out and the whole edifice collapses. They could end up getting into a real mess. I just think it's a job that doesn't need doing. And it's going to be difficult to do properly. It's not that I don't think it's not like a worthy aim. It's just I think it's going to take resources away from what will be more effective. That's my view. So on to the final one to do with artifacts. So one particular challenge for the class design team throughout Legion was handling the introduction and eventual removal of artifacts. Sorry. The idea was exciting. Yay. Design a large set of bonuses with the intention that they would be contained within an expansion, allowing us to make them flashier, more complex, and more numerous than we've been able to in a specialization's permanent set of core abilities. But the process of parting with the artifacts produces a complex set of decisions about how to adjust the base classes to play in their absence. Absolutely. The largest issue is where the pacing of a spec's rotation was heavily affected by artifacts. In that case, removing the artifact may result in a rotation that's too slow or has too much open time where the core buttons aren't available. In the process of reviewing and updating each spec for Battle for Azeroth, we want to make sure all of them are paced appropriately after the removal of artifacts. In some cases, we may do things like increase resource generation or reduce cooldowns to fill in some of the newly opened space. For traits that go beyond simple numerical changes and have their own identity, such as active abilities or the powerful and noticeable procs, we are on the lookout across all specs for a small selection of traits that are worth turning into permanent parts of a class. Now, this is exactly what I had suggested they should do. That obviously, I mean, some people will focus on the main artifact ability, the first one you get when you first get your artifact. But in actual fact, we've got over half a dozen new abilities via the artifact, which as soon as we unequip our artifact, disappear. We're not going to get to keep all of them. Of course we're not. Some specs may not get to keep any of them. We understand that. But I've absolutely said that where something has been an integral part of the gameplay, that it should just be baked into the baseline core of the spec. And they seem to be agreeing with that. We may not agree on which those abilities should be, but at least philosophically, for the first time probably in this vlog, we agree. They and I agree on this. Absolutely. You know, and it shouldn't be a large selection. You shouldn't just bake in the artifact into the character, but a small selection. The artifact was supposed to be what was really powerful, not just us. So absolutely it makes sense if we have to get rid of the artifacts that we lose a great deal of that power. Absolutely. But that some things, just for the sake of gameplay, are going to need to be retained. The bar is a high for a trait to become permanent. It's an intended part of the experience of a system like artifacts that the bonuses are layered on top of the core functionality of your class. You get to explore those bonuses thoroughly, but eventually move on from them. That leaves space in the permanent classes for new special bonuses from other systems in the future, as we'll be soon exploring with Azerite armor. That said, various specs will likely see one or two familiar traits from the artifacts showing up in their talent trees in Battle for Azeroth. Now, I have views on that for my particular spec, but I'm going to leave that for Saturday's rep vlog. I'll be talking about that then. But again, I don't have any philosophical objection to that. Which traits they choose for each of those is fine. And it makes sense in many ways. There are just dead talents. We know that there are dead talents, and it would make sense for some artifact traits just to occupy the space that those dead... Just get rid of those dead talents. Stop trying to flog a dead horse. The traits that were useful but not essential, have them as talent options. As long as they don't become a dead choice, because everything along the line is more powerful in every situation, then that absolutely makes sense to me. So there we go. We got to end on a note of semi-agreement, which is always nice. Those are my thoughts. Make sure you put your thoughts below. I know you will. If you've enjoyed the vlog, don't forget to give it a like. Subscribe if it's the first time to my channel. We'll see when the beta opens up. Will it open up in the next couple of days, as some people seem to think it will, or will it be next week? I'm certain it will be by next week. And then let's see if I manage to sneak my way in. It'll be very hit and miss. I'm not sure I will, but fingers crossed. Thanks very much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.